It was a crisp spring morning outside Buckingham Palace. The gates shimmered in golden light, tourists already pressing forward with phones, chatter, and excitement. In the center of this swirl stood a young girl, still silent and visibly nervous. Her name was Isla Monroe. She wore a pale yellow cardigan over a long floral dress. Her hands were tightly clutched around a small brown teddy bear, its fur worn from years of squeezing. Her shoes didn't match. Her hair was in loose, uneven braids, and her eyes, wide and blue, moved rapidly, not at the palace but at the people. She wasn't like the other children. She didn't laugh, didn't run, didn't wave. Instead, Isla stood in front of a red velvet rope barrier, her body swaying slightly from side to side in rhythm. Her mouth whispered something only she could understand, and her eyes remained locked, not on the palace but on the Queensguard, standing motionless near the north post. And soon, the whispers started. "Is she all right? Why is she making those sounds? Poor thing, looks off." It only took a few minutes for someone to say it louder than they should have. "God, she's embarrassing us." That voice belonged to a woman in a tailored navy coat, her mother, Vanessa Monroe. She was tall, perfectly styled, and visibly tense, her jaw tight, her heels sharp, her clutch bag clamped tightly like a weapon. Vanessa wasn't cruel, but she was terrified. Terrified of judgment, terrified of eyes on her daughter, terrified of being seen as the failed mother. As Isla continued to rock and hum, Vanessa bent down sharply. "Isla, sweetheart, please just stand still. You're drawing attention." Isla didn't stop. She wasn't being disobedient. She just didn't know how to pause who she was. The Queen's Guard stationed that day was Corporal James Barrett, 37 years old. He had the look of a man carved from marble, square jaw, weather-worn skin, and eyes that hadn't flinched in a decade. Standing 6'2" in full red ceremonial uniform and tall bearskin hat, he was the picture of stoic tradition. But inside that rigid posture was a man very much aware of what was happening. Barrett had been a guard for over 15 years. He'd seen every manner of tourist, prankster, child, and diplomat. But today, something about Isla's stillness amidst the chaos pulled at him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but he could observe. And what he saw was this: a little girl yearning to connect with no one around her trying to understand her language. Every so often, Isla would step slightly forward, just a few inches, her eyes fixed on Barrett's tall, unmoving form. And each time, Vanessa would yank her back like a leash. "Don't make a scene. People are looking. Just stay behind the rope." Barrett saw it, and he didn't blink. But his jaw tightened. Later that day, as tourists shuffled away and guards rotated, Vanessa and Isla stayed seated on a nearby bench. That's when the others arrived. Vanessa's sister, Emily, was dressed in all white, perfect makeup, matching handbag. Her son, Matthew, wore a miniature suit and tie and carried himself like a junior ambassador, polite, stiff, presentable. And loud enough for Corporal Barrett to hear from across the courtyard, Emily leaned into Vanessa and said, "You should have left her at home. You know how this looks, right? She's your daughter, Vanessa, but she's a distraction, a disgrace in photos. Mother's going to be furious." Isla sat on the far end of the bench, humming to her bear. Her knees bounced. Her gaze drifted to the guards again. Barrett didn't move, but he heard every word. And in that moment, something ancient stirred inside him, not rage, not pity, a protective instinct, one he hadn't felt since his deployment in Helmand Province, when he once shielded a wounded child with his own body. He felt that same heat rising now, but all he could do was stand. As the sun peaked above the courtyard, a private photographer arrived, booked by the Monroe family for their royal afternoon keepsake. He was chipper, energetic, and totally unaware of the emotional landmines. Okay, everyone. Big smiles in front of the guard. This will be a lovely family Christmas card. Emily pulled Matthew to the center. Vanessa hesitated. Isla wandered a few steps forward, eyes back on Barrett. The photographer smiled at her. Oh, and you must be Isla. Want to stand next to your cousin. Isla didn't respond. She clutched her bear and stared at the guard. The photographer moved to adjust her gently, but Vanessa stepped in. Don't touch her. She won't pose. It'll ruin the shot. Emily sighed. Just let her sit out. Honestly, she doesn't need to be in it. Barrett saw Isla glance down. She wasn't fully aware of what they were saying, but she felt it. And she slowly walked backward toward the gate again, back to her silent, tall protector. Barrett felt something inside him tear. He had stood through jeers, insults, drunken nonsense, even threats, but this was different. A child, rejected, not by strangers, by her own blood. Barrett did something unthinkable. With robotic slowness, he broke form. First, he lowered his eyes, just for a second, directly toward Isla. Then, as she reached the rope line, he moved one gloved hand, ever so slightly, and gave a deliberate tap to his boot, twice, left, then right. Isla froze, then smiled, and with her bear pressed to her chest, she tapped her own feet in rhythm. Vanessa gasped. Emily's jaw dropped. He moved. Did he just move? For her? The crowd began whispering. Phones came up. Barrett returned to full form. But he knew. He'd broken the rule. And it had been worth it. That evening, Barrett was called into a small administrative room inside the barracks. He expected punishment, demotion, at least a reprimand. But instead, his superior officer, a man named Lieutenant Graham, sat across the desk, stone-faced, holding a printed photo. It showed Barrett tapping his boot, and Isla smiling back. Graham looked at him. I know what the rule book says. I also know what honor looks like. He slid the photo across the table. You didn't dishonor the uniform today, Barrett. You reminded people why we wear it. Barrett swallowed. Graham added, There's talk about setting up something new, a liaison post between the Guard and differently abled youth programs. They want someone who understands restraint and compassion. Barrett didn't speak, but his silence said everything. 4 days had passed. 4. Since that small tap of his boot, since Corporal James Barrett did something unthinkable, broke centuries of stillness for a little girl who wasn't like the others. And now, Isla was back. Every day, just after the morning rotation, she returned. Yellow cardigan, teddy bear in hand, shoes slightly mismatched, hair a little wild. Her mother stood close, less tense than before, but the eyes of others still lingered. And each time, Isla approached the velvet rope again. She didn't speak. She didn't cross it. She just stood there, smiling up at Barrett, tapping her shoes quietly. Left, right, and in his mind, without moving, Barrett did it too. Left, right, a silent dialogue, a conversation of rhythm and presence, every day. What Barrett didn't know was that someone had filmed the moment, the original tap, the girl's smile, the reaction of the crowd, and that video, titled A Royal Guard Breaks Protocol for a Special Girl, had now amassed over 1.2 million views on YouTube and was climbing. People weren't laughing. They were crying. She wasn't invisible. He saw her when no one else did. More men like him, please. News outlets had begun requesting interviews with the palace. Disability advocates reached out, and an unexpected petition began circulating across parenting groups in the UK. Let the guards speak for them. Barrett ignored it all. He hadn't done it to be seen. But now, everyone saw. And not just him. Isla. On the 5th day, Corporal Barrett was summoned again, this time not for discipline. He was brought to a quiet drawing room in the East Wing, where an older woman sat waiting. She introduced herself simply, Lady Meredith, Her Majesty's Special Advisor on Accessibility. She handed him a cream-colored envelope, sealed with a gold crest. What you did was both against protocol and entirely right. Her Majesty was informed, and she agrees. Barrett said nothing. She smiled gently. There's a young girl who won't stop asking about you, and we'd like to propose something. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. The uniform was never meant to silence kindness. E.R. Barrett blinked. He wasn't a man who got emotional. But this hit different. A week later, under unusually soft skies, Isla and Vanessa were escorted past the iron gates for a private tour. Vanessa had been hesitant. She wasn't used to being invited in. She was used to being whispered about from the outside. But Isla's excitement had overruled everything. She clutched her bear so tightly it looked like its stuffing would burst. And waiting for them on the stone pathway, not in full ceremonial gear, but in standard dress uniform, stood Corporal Barrett. Without the bearskin hat, his face looked more human, softer, real. Isla ran to him, stopping just short of his polished boots. She didn't speak. She just stood and tapped her feet, left, right. Barrett smiled gently, and this time he tapped back. No one said a word, but everyone felt it. The rest of the day unfolded like something out of a quiet dream. Barrett guided Isla through the inner courtyard, explaining with soft words, mostly to Vanessa, how the guard functioned, what the uniform represented, and how strict the code had always been. But his attention remained on Isla. He pointed to flags, let her touch the cold stone of the palace wall, even showed her how to properly stand at ease. And when she mimicked him, awkward, uncertain, he gave the faintest nod of approval. Vanessa, watching from behind, wiped tears more than once. For the first time in what felt like years, Isla wasn't being managed. She was being welcomed. As the tour wound down, Isla and Barrett found themselves alone in the smaller archway just before the West Barracks. Isla suddenly looked up. For the first time, she spoke. "Do you think I'm broken?" Barrett froze. Vanessa gasped from behind. "Isla!" Barrett knelt slowly, one knee on the stone, and for the first time in uniform, in public, and with full permission, he spoke. "No. I think the world doesn't always understand special things. But that doesn't make them broken." Isla stared at him. "You're quiet, too." Barrett smiled. "Sometimes the world speaks too much." She thought about that, then nodded. "That's why I like you." Vanessa turned away, hand covering her face. 2 weeks after the private tour, the story had exploded. Royal Guard breaks protocol for girl with autism. A silent salute that shook a nation. The day dignity moved. The video, now over 15 million views, had done more than trend. It had started conversations around dinner tables, on school playgrounds, in parliament committee rooms. Parents shared their own stories. Veterans wrote letters. Teachers began asking how to show their students this kind of courage. One MP even stood in the House of Commons and said, "It's rare in today's world that restraint is more powerful than rebellion. But in that courtyard, a silent guard taught us everything we'd forgotten about respect, visibility, and humanity." But amidst all the noise, Corporal Barrett did what he always had. He stood still. A surprise letter arrived at the Monroe home. Isla is invited to attend the Queen's Spring Garden ceremony as a junior honoree. Vanessa dropped it when she read it aloud. That's not possible. She doesn't do crowds. She doesn't wear dresses. She stopped. Isla was already smiling and clutching the bear tighter. She didn't understand everything, but she understood that. It wasn't about royalty. It was about being wanted. Over the following days, Barrett was quietly assigned to help Isla rehearse, off-duty, in plain clothes. He taught her how to walk slowly in rhythm with guards. He showed her how to bow gently, not because it was required, but because ceremony could be its own kind of language. Vanessa watched as her daughter, once thought unreachable, was now holding eye contact for minutes at a time. With him. One evening, during rehearsal, Barrett sat beside Isla on the edge of the west courtyard. The sun was setting, turning the palace gold. Isla leaned close and whispered almost inaudibly, "You're the first person who doesn't try to fix me." Barrett blinked. "You're not broken," she paused. "That's not what people say. They say I ruin things, that I'm too loud, too quiet, too much." Barrett took a long breath. "Then maybe they've been listening to the wrong kind of silence." "Because Isla, you speak louder than anyone I know." She looked up at him. "Really?" He nodded. "Every time you tap your feet, you're telling the world, I'm here." The garden was packed. Lavender bushes flanked the velvet path. Musicians played softly. Dignitaries in tailored suits milled around. Photographers took polite, rapid-fire photos. And then came the moment. A hush fell. The announcer read the name aloud, "Junior honoree, Miss Isla Monroe." The crowd turned. And there she was, wearing a pale blue dress, clutching her bear, and walking carefully beside Corporal James Barrett, now back in full red ceremonial uniform. But this time, something was different. Isla held his hand, and he let her. They walked together to the center of the lawn. The Queen was not present, but her representative stepped forward. "Miss Monroe, for reminding us that honor is not in how still we stand, but in how fully we see one another." He pinned a small brooch to her dress. Isla beamed. Barrett didn't move, but his eyes, behind that blank stare, gleamed with pride. It wasn't the ceremony that went viral. It was what happened after. The microphone had been left on accidentally. The speaker stepped away, and Isla turned toward Barrett and whispered, "Was I perfect?" A long pause. Barrett knelt again, slowly, just as before. "You were more than perfect. You were real. And that's what they'll remember." Somehow, someone captured that moment, and when the video hit the internet, it became more than a story. It became a movement. Weeks passed. Barrett received thousands of messages, but one stood out. It was handwritten. "Dear Corporal Barrett, I'm 14. I'm on the spectrum. My parents used to say I'd never be normal. But then I saw you on the screen. I saw you listen without speaking. And I thought, maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I'm just not heard yet. Thank you for being the first person who listened without asking me to change." Barrett read the letter twice, then folded it and tucked it behind his badge. He never told anyone. But that letter stayed with him longer than any medal. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, a unique sound echoed across the palace courtyard. Tiny footsteps, tapping in rhythm, left, right, left, right. Isla, now part of a ceremonial inclusion initiative, was given a special moment in the changing of the guard. Just 3 steps. Just once. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She just walked. Straight, proud, and steady, past a line of guards who saluted in silence. And waiting at the end of that line was Corporal James Barrett, not moving, not speaking. But she didn't need him to. She tapped her feet once. He blinked just once, and she smiled like she owned the world. The courtyard looked the same. Same iron gates, same red uniforms, same towering black hats. But the girl standing on the other side of the velvet rope was not the same child who once clutched a teddy bear and spoke with her shoes. She was taller now, still silent, still brilliant, and she was staring at the same man, older now, lines deepening around his eyes, posture still perfect. Corporal James Barrett. The world had changed, but their story had never stopped changing it. 3 years after the garden ceremony, something extraordinary happened. A special education academy was opened in South London. It wasn't massive, but it was intentional. Its motto, "Silence is not absence." And etched into the glass at the front of the building, 2 silhouettes stood engraved. One, a little girl tapping her shoes. The other, a guard, perfectly still. The school was named the Isla Monroe School for Dignity and Inclusion. And when it opened, Corporal Barrett didn't attend the press events. He just stood quietly outside the gates, watching, saluting once, then walking away. That was enough. After 21 years of service, Corporal Barrett received formal clearance for retirement. The palace offered a public ceremony. He declined. When pressed, he gave a single sentence: "Stillness doesn't need applause." But the palace had other plans. On his final day, at the exact time of his last rotation, a small group gathered inside the gates. Most of them were uninvited. Parents of autistic children, veterans, nurses, volunteers, and at the center of them all, Isla, holding a white card. It read, "You taught me how to be seen." As Barrett stepped back from his post, she approached slowly. She tapped her feet, left, right, then hugged him. He broke protocol one final time and hugged her back. A year into retirement, Barrett rarely spoke of the events. He lived quietly in Dorset by the sea, walked the cliffs, read history books, but every Sunday he returned to the same bench outside Buckingham Palace. Not in uniform, just as a man, and every now and then someone would recognize him, not for his medals, but for what he didn't do. "You're the guard who didn't move, right?" "No," he'd answer. "I moved when it mattered." On her 16th birthday, Isla Monroe stood at a podium for the first time in her life. A room full of donors, educators, and parliament members fell silent. She looked nervous, then smiled, then signed. And a voice translator seated nearby began reading aloud. "My name is Isla. I don't speak the way most of you do, but I learned that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. I learned that dignity can be silent. I learned it from a soldier who didn't blink when the world mocked me, who didn't flinch when they called me a disgrace. He didn't shout, he stood. And because he stood, I learned how to." The room was frozen. And then, applause, thunderous, and somewhere in the back row, a man in a dark suit wiped his eyes behind thick glasses. Months after the speech, Isla received a package. Inside was a carefully folded red uniform and a note. "Dear Isla, you don't need this to stand tall, but if ever you forget how powerful stillness can be, hold this. And remember, with honor, JB." Isla didn't cry. She just tapped her feet once, twice, and held the fabric to her chest. It's easy to forget stories like these. They don't scream. They don't trend forever. They don't end in violence or spectacle. But for those who were watching, it never ended at all. Because every time someone says, "She was a disgrace," there will be a voice, soft but firm, that says, "Number. She was a mirror, and he was what we all should be when the world tests our dignity. A man who didn't need words to speak, a girl who didn't need to speak to be heard, and a story that stood still, but moved everyone."